Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon. So for today's lecture, I'm going to continue with the application layer discussion. As I mentioned before, in application layer protocol, we have, for example, SMTP, HTTP, RTP, and FTP, and others. So in this lecture today, I'm going to discuss on the HTTP, SMTP, and FTP. So this is the basic protocol in application layer. So in this slide, I'm going to discuss on the web and the HTTP. So web page consists of base HTML file which include several reference objects. Each object is addressable by a URL. So for this web page, which is the running protocol is, we call it HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So for HTTP, it uses client-server model. So we have a client, which is us using a computer, and a server, which respond of the request that made by the client. So for example, client browse and request a web page, and server will respond by sending the information to the client. So for HTTP, it uses TCP, Transport Layer Protocol. TCP is, once again I will tell you, Transmission Control Protocol, TCP. HTTP is basically use a stateless server which maintain no information about the past client requests. For HTTP connection, there are two types that you need to know. First are non-persistent, and the second is persistent HTTP. Non-persistent is at most one object is sent over a TCP connection. However, in persistent HTTP, which is the default mode of the HTTP protocol, multiple objects can be sent over a single TCP connection between client and server. First, let's look into the non-persistent HTTP. If you look at this figure, you can see there's a client and server. And the other thing that you need to know is RTT. What is RTT? RTT is round trip time, which is the time it takes for a small packet or information to travel from one client to server and then back to the client. So basically, if a client requests information and it get the server reply the information, it is called 1 RTT, round trip time. So if you look at this figure, you can say that non-persistent HTTP requires a total of 2 RTT, round trip time, because the first RTT is to initiate the connection between the client and server, and the second is to request the information and the server respond to the clients. So here it says that total is equal to 2 RTT plus transmit time. Transmit time means the time that the information sent from the server to the client, which is the entire file transmitted. So basically, non-persistent HTTP has issue or problem. First is a brand new connection must be established and maintained for each request object. Means that if you look back the slide before, you can say that once the request information has been transmitted from the server to client, it will close the connection, and if the client requests another information, they will need to have another 2 RTT, which is take a lot of time. So they need to initiate the connection back again, although they already have the initiate the connection before. So means that another information, another 2 RTT and so on. So it will take a lot of time to transmit and request and receive information. The second is each object suffer a delivery delay of 2 RTT. So this I already explained it. Okay. I hope that with this figure you can clearly understand the difference between persistent and non-persistent. So just look into this first and second figure first. So the first figure here is the non-persistent HTTP. If you look at this, for example, this is request and this is response from client to server. So once the response information has been sent, it will close connection, and then it will repeat again every time the client requests information. So this from the established connection to the closed connection, it requires 2 RTT and so on. Compared to this connection, which is the persistent connection, so the required established the required initiate the initiate connection only happen only one time for multiple request information. If you look at this, established connection and closed connection just happen one time compared to the non-persistent HTTP. So it requires 3 times. So in one time, established connection, it can send multiple requests and receive multiple information. This is what we call persistent connection. So if you look at the time here, so the persistent connection require less time compared to the non-persistent HTTP. And on the right side here is the HTTP pipelining. For persistent HTTP connection, there are 2 types, non-pipeline and with pipeline. So this is with pipelining, means that during after the established connection, it can send multiple requests without waiting for the response information. Compared to this one, it will need to wait until all the information is been received. Then the client can send another request to the server. But for pipelining, HTTP pipelining, the client does not have to wait for the received information. So this one, for this pipelining HTTP, it requires less time compared to the persistent connection. Okay, let's look into the HTTP message. So there are 2 types of HTTP message. The first is request and the second is response messages. So what you are looking into this, what you are looking at is the HTTP request message. So basically this is the general format of a request message. So on the first line there's a method, URL and version, and this line is a what we call request line. So in method usually we will there are a few types. The one that I show you is just a normal or frequent method that is used in HTTP. So get, for example, is to request an object from server. Post is to upload information using form and so on. And URL is the URL of the request website, and version is the version of HTTP. And here the example is 1.0 version. And the headline is They put info about connection, date, type of server, and also the date for the last modified header line. And the entity body is the information, or what we call the information that you want to request, or the data. So this is the response message. Once you request, you send from this client to the server. The server will respond and send a message to the client. So this is the general format of a response message. It's the same format as the request. There's a status line, there's a header line, and entity body. In the difference is at the status line, which there's a version, status code, and phrase. So usually the important part is the status code. The status code shows the response, the status of the response message. If it's okay, the status code should be 200. If it's bad request, the status will show 400. So it shows different value of status, depends on the request and response message. So now we are looking at the file transfer protocol, FTP. So what's the difference between HTTP and FTP? So HTTP is more of request of web page. Compared to file transfer protocol, FTP, you are requesting a file. So that's the main difference. For example, in this picture, you are a client and you are requesting a file transfer to the server. For example, Google Drive. So this protocol is using FTP. It's either you upload or download it. So what's the difference between HTTP and FTP? So both are transfer protocol, but the difference is HTTP transferring hypertext, which is web page, most of it, and FTP is file. And the example is, the similar is both are running on TCP, Transmission Control Protocol. Another main difference is the port number. HTTP using 80 port number 80, and FTP is using port 21 and 20. So port 21 is used for control connection, and port 20 is for data connection, that I will be discussing on the next slide. So for example, a client want to download a file from the FTP server, for example Google Drive server. So first, client browse remote directory by sending command over control connection using port 21 here. So first establish connection between client and server, and then when the server receive file transfer command, server open second TCP connection for file transfer to the client. So it establish second connection using port 20 for data connection. So because of the client requests download data, so the server will upload or transmit the data to the client. So after transferring one file, server close data connection. So server open another TCP data connection to transfer another file. Means that once the file has been transferred, the port 20 will be closed, and then server will wait for the client to give another command to transfer another file. Then they will open another connection using port 20. Okay, that's all for today's lecture. We already discussed about HTTP and HTTP. So next week I will go into the SMTP for mail transfer, and maybe on a bit on DNS. Okay, that's all. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.